Four of the most important statistical measures are the average, the median, the maximum, and the minimum for a range. And these are easily calculated in any kind of spreadsheet. And if we turn on the formulas by going to View, Show Formulas, we'll see the calculations that are behind those cells. So the orange cell here is the average. So what I did is I said equals average of the range from B2 to B28. So B2 was the first cell or the first city in that series. And then B28 was the number of days of unhealthful air for the last city in that series, which is Washington, D.C. So when I turn or hide the formulas, then I see the actual value. So in other words, that there's a formula behind those values. Now to calculate percentages, let's say I wanted to calculate the percentage of unhealthful days in Atlanta. So I'll just go here and I'll say, all right, I'll retype and I'll say equals the number, which happens to be B2, divided by the number of days in the year, 365, and if you account for leap year, 20.25. And now if I want to copy that formula there, I can simply click from this little pull box here, pull it all the way down, and it'll calculate percentages, but they're already calculated in the spreadsheet. So now if I wanted to graph this data, let's say I wanted to graph the number of days of unhealthful air and the percentage of days of unhealthful air for each of those cities. Now, notice that days and percentage of days are two different variables. They have different measures. In other words, one is measured here in like any number from 1 to 365, and this one over here is any value between 0 and 1. So we have to account for that. Let's go ahead and click on city, A1, and then we'll shift click on the last entrance, percentage of unhealthful days for DC. And by doing the shift, we select everything in between. Now what we can do is we can go ahead and graph that. So we'll choose the More tool here and say, let's go ahead and insert the chart. And now we have that information, but it's a little hard to see because the graph is covering over the data itself. So I typically like to click on the More menu here and move to its own sheet so we can see what's going on. Now, you can only see blue bars here. That's because these two things by default are measured on the same scale. And so if this represents the number of unhealthful days, then we can see here 93 at Riverside being the worst. And but we see this graph with dips and drops, but we don't see these. And that's because the percentage of unhealthful days, the maximum percentage you can have would be 100%, which would be 1.00. And on a graph where our values range between 0 and 100, you're just not going to see that. There's a little red there under Fresno, Bakersfield, and Riverside. They're just barely showing on the graph. So what we need to do is we need to do a combination chart so we can see the two different axes. So click on the Edit the Chart, and now we're going to go to Setup here. And what we want to do is we want to change it from a column chart to a combination chart. Now, here's a combination chart. Now, that doesn't solve our problem immediately because we need to change the axes of the right axis. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to look over here and we're going to see, okay, there's days of unhealthful air and there's days of percentage of days that are unhealthful. Well, if we go to the Customize and click under the Series tool right here, this option here is I'm going to select, instead of Apply to All Series, I'm going to click on the arrow. Whenever you see the arrow, that means that there's more underneath that. I'm going to say the percentage of unhealthful days. And I'm going to say, you know what? Blue looks healthy. So I want to change this to unhealthy to better represent, the smog that's in the air. So right now that's going to be gray there representing that. And that's going to be the left axis. So that's going to be the left axis. That's going to be valued in terms of the number of days. But if I change this now to days of unhealthful air, which I'll keep in red because that's just kind of a good visualization, I'm going to use this as a line chart. And I'm going to format this on the right axis. Now, here we can see that the line represents the percentage of days, but still it's on the wrong axis because it's going between 0 and 30%. We wanted to go to actually change that value. So how do we change that value? Okay, we go to the vertical axis here because we're dealing with the vertical axis, and what we want to change is the right vertical axis. So under the right vertical axis, I'm going to choose the minimum value as 0 and the maximum value is 1, representing 100%. And now we can see that the axis does change over here to represent percentages. And when we close that out, we now have a graph of the days of unhealthful air per year and the percentage of unhealthful days per year, two different variables plotted on the same graph.